of analysis all the time, and it's hard to determine which level of analysis you should focus on, especially when something complicated is happening. The way I experienced it was that I went into the Channel 4 studio and I sat and well, first in the green room where everything was quite friendly. Cathy was being made up in there, and so we had a pleasant interchange, I would say. And then I was brought into a room where the interview took place with the cameras, and we spoke for 2 or 3 minutes before the cameras rolled, and she was pleasant and engaging, distracted a bit, but it's exactly what you'd expect, right? She's got her mind on many things. But
you can follow us both on Twitter even, and of course Channel 4 News continues online, channel4.com/news.
But then the cameras went on, and she just was a completely different person instantly. And so that was interesting. You know, it was interesting to me that she had both of those approaches so instantaneously at her disposal, you know. And so, of course, the first thing that entered my mind was, well, you know, my eyebrows went up, and I thought, okay, which of these two people is the real person, right? And then well, you could say she played devil's advocate. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. She laid out a set of ideological presuppositions, 2 sets actually, her set and my set. And the set of ideological presuppositions that she laid out for my side of the argument bore very little resemblance to anything that I think or say. And so she would ask me a question, which wasn't really a question. It was a barb with bait on the end of it.
Maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution. And I would respond, and then she would tell me...
So you're saying?
Yeah, she would say what I said, except then what she would say had nothing to do with what I'd say. She was actually... She was fabricating on the fly the person that she hoped, the villain that she hoped I would be, and then insisting that that was me and that denying it was a lie. Essentially, that's what the interview was.
So let me just get straight. You're saying that we should organize our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures.
So it's deeply insincere because she was playing an ideological persona, and she wanted you to play one as well.
Well, she wanted me to be the proper foil for that, you know, and was insistent, is the right word, that I abide by that particular decision.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay.
But there was more to the interview than that, because it was, I mean, I've had a lot of experience listening to people. Tens of thousands of hours of experience listening to people, because I'm a clinical psychologist and I've had an extensive practice, and I've dealt with every sort of person you could possibly imagine, and a very large number of people that you couldn't imagine no matter how long you tried. So I was watching her after the first minute like a clinician instead of like an interviewer, and I was really paying attention to what she was doing. And I truly don't believe that anything she said in that entire interview was true on its own. It was all, I actually have a chapter about this in my book called Assume That the Person You're Listening to Knows Something You Don't, which is a taxonomy of conversational types and a discussion about how to engage in a conversation if what you're trying to do is further your knowledge of the truth. If both of you are trying to further your knowledge of the truth, which is a proper conversation, it's the highest form of conversation, not the only form. You could amuse each other too, that's a perfectly good form, or you can have a friendly spar, or you can play a primate dominance hierarchy game, which is very, very common, which is mostly what was happening in that interview. Yes, and it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time. But it's no formula for a successful long-term relationship. That's reciprocal, right? But she was using her words as tools to attain a particular kind of end. And I couldn't exactly figure out what the end was. Some of it would be to dominate the interviewee, especially if that's a person, then that would be contaminated with ideological correctness. You want to dominate your interviewee if you believe that they're wrong from an ideological perspective. And you want to do that, number one, to attain victory, and number two, to buttress your ideological points. Yeah. So there was that. Then there was some devil's advocate, I suppose, and maybe that's more forgivable because you could say that she has a responsibility to do that as a journalist, which I don't believe, by the way. Yeah. Asking difficult questions and playing the devil's advocate are not the same thing, even though sometimes playing the devil's advocate is necessary. And then I think there was an underlay of career grandstanding. I don't know that much about her, and I don't know how she's made her reputation, but she is obviously a combative person, and my suspicions are that she's made a success of putting people, maybe she's made a success of herself in other ways, but she's made a success of herself, at least in part, by putting people uncomfortably on the spot.
My friend Jordan Peterson, who's really terrific, he was being interviewed on, I believe it was CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and he was asked by this interviewer about why he does not use the gendered pronouns that transgender people would appreciate. And this interview goes very, very poorly for the interviewer. I mean, this one goes under Peterson Destroys on YouTube. It's just hideous. Here we go.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I've exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. So and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
ha, gotcha.
Okay, so yes, that is a bad moment for her because this is obviously true. Every political conversation I've ever had about these subjects is always, why should what you want to say trump my right to not hear you say it? It's like, because that's the definition of freedom of speech. And we can't have a conversation unless I'm actually telling you what I think. Okay, but this is how dumb the left is. They actually think that I'm supposed to manufacture what I believe and think in order to please particular people, which is the opposite of an honest political conversation. Okay, time, you know what? We can skip the thing that...
Jordan Peterson is getting the Milo treatment. Maybe by now you've seen that amazing car crash interview on Channel 4, and if you haven't, watch the end of this and then immediately go to YouTube and find the 27 or the 29-minute version because it's amazing. Now, Jordan Peterson is able to do what most of us only dream about, which is, and I've done it myself in interviews on occasion, but I don't always get it right. I have been on Channel 4 with Cathy Newman, who is a sort of hyper feminist British presenter. And she asked me some of the same questions with some of the same interview technique. Now, what Cathy Newman does, and I don't know because I haven't worked out whether this is all part of a clever strategy to get right-wingers to say weird and wacky and outrageous things, but what she'll do is she'll listen to a nuanced and complex answer to a contentious and emotionally charged subject, let's say the wage gap or campus rape culture, and she'll listen for sort of trigger words, and then she'll restate it's not even restating your argument. What she does is she uses a few words to construct an outrageous, so what you're saying is X statement, which has no relation whatsoever to what your original claim was. So you might say something like, well, if you perform a multivariate analysis, you discover actually that the wage gap is there for a variety of reasons, not just sex and certainly not just discrimination, but women's choices, different educational choices, women's priorities, and she'll cut you off and respond something like, so what you're saying is there's no point trying to fight for equality because it's never going to happen, and women should just get used to not being equal. And it's very difficult to respond to that kind of interviewing. And I don't know whether that's a result of she's either brilliant or actually her IQ is 75. Either way, it's effective when you're interviewing right-wingers, because anyone really, because she's able to caricature your position in the most grotesque terms in a very aggressive way that is designed to kind of get under people's skin. Now, Jordan Peterson gave a half-an-hour interview about a variety of different things. He has a new book coming out, his Guide to Life or 12 Steps to Happiness or whatever it is. He's got a new book coming out. He's talking about the wage gap. He's talking about equality, all kinds of things like that. And she's throwing these weird, crazy they're not summaries of his positions, because they're actually in many cases the opposite of what he believes. She's listening for keywords or terms and throwing out aggressive, baseless questions designed to make him sound nuts. So she's asking, so you believe this? No, I never said that. Here's what I believe. So you believe this? No, I never said that. And this goes on for about half an hour, and it's absolutely gripping if you're really into this kind of stuff like I am. And if you're not, it's actually very bad television, but it demonstrates one of the strategies that they use to interview those of us who understand that not everything is really super simple, and you can't just say, oh, there's a wage gap of 9%, the world must stop turning until we fix it. Those of us who want to talk about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, women's different educational choices, yada, yada, yada. There's sort of subtlety and complexity that modern feminism does not permit, and certainly feminism on television doesn't let you get away with. This is the stuff that can get people into trouble. Anyway, look, so this interview, grueling, half-an-hour viewing. It's either great television or a brilliant evisceration, a car crash for her, depending on your perspective. But what happened afterwards was even more telling than her interview technique. So, it's a perfect lesson, by the way. I'm going to talk to you later in the show about how this stuff works and why they do this. But I want to draw your attention to a Twitter thread from a user called Cheeky Scrump, who gets it exactly right. And I'm going to read you out what he said. He said, Cathy Newman got crushed on broadcast TV, and they're reframing her being laughed at as vicious, misogynistic abuse. That's not abuse from Peterson, but that's abuse from the comment section afterwards. People basically saying, haha, you got owned, or whatever, or, whatever it is, wrecked. This is we're going to talk in a minute about what exactly that abuse really looks like versus how it's reported in the press. But this user, Cheeky Scrum, I don't know who he is. He seems to be like a Dungeons & Dragons fan who also has great insight into gender politics. Must be a Gamergate guy. This is how the media will go after Peterson. You can bet your ass they'll never allow him on TV again because he destroyed them. The Guardian, doing stellar propaganda work as always, is saying Jordan Peterson has a large following in the, quote, alt-right, end quote, who fucking hate and mock him. Let me spell out exactly how this is going to go, says the user on Twitter. I'm going to read to you a page of his. This is because what he's done is he's seen it happen to me, and now he's seen it happen to Jordan Peterson, and now he's created this roadmap. And it's the neatest explanation of this that I've ever seen, including in my own columns. So I'm going to read the whole thing to you. Channel 4 and Cathy Newman know they got obliterated in that debate, and they aren't happy with their narrative being destroyed. There's going to be a media campaign to prevent this happening again. Step 1, which is where we are now, change the conversation from the loss of the debate to vile online abuse, having the vile online abuse that the debate has caused. Channel 4 are making a big show of this, hiring a security agent. They were very public about the fact they'd have to hire a security agent for Cathy Newman, but they're showing no evidence of the threats. Step 1, part 2, we're still here. The articles that are coming out about it, this huge media furore about the supposedly misogynistic abuse that the presenter is getting, allow the media to frame Jordan Peterson as being transphobic or hateful or whatever, and they help lies like him being alt-right because they'll try to associate the worst of what's happening on the internet with him just because we're all, of course, totally responsible for everything that all of our fans say at all times. This removes people from the primary source video and controls the narrative about what Jordan Peterson believes. So what they're doing is they're saying, well, because Jordan Peterson is surrounded by a load of harassers and abusers and threateners on the internet, that's what he believes too. He's just as bad as all of them. Now let's talk about how bad that abuse was. Interestingly, in this conversation, the question of what was said in the debate and who won and who said what and who you agree with is starting to become a bit muddier because the attention isn't on that anymore. The attention is not on what was on television, what was said. The attention is now on the story around this show. So step 2, says this guy, Peterson will be asked to disavow his own fan base, and he'll be conflated with any and all abuse online that women receive. His refusal to roll over in the face of this will be framed as an endorsement of harassment, and the more naked agendered media will carry endless hit pieces. Absolutely true. Happened to me, it's now happening to him. Having Jordan Peterson on a TV show or at an event will be reframed as dangerous to women or endorsing a harasser, and he will be banned from UK events and interviews, and his events will be cancelled due to safety. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It should, because there was a mischievous homosexual fag who was experiencing just this same thing in June 2015 and all the way ever since, right up until today. So, what this demonstrates is great that this is happening. What this demonstrates is not just me being out there, being crazy, upsetting people, trolling people, having this band of whatever follow me around everywhere that makes it impossible to interview me or impossible whatever. This is not a Milo problem. This is a left problem. This is a problem of their own invention and fabrication, their own making. And now they're doing it to Jordan Peterson, who is way more mild-mannered than I am. Far more beyond reproach than I am. I know that I upset people on purpose, and I'm perfectly happy to admit it. But Jordan Peterson is up there in Christina Hoff Sommers territory. So they're doing it to him too. Step 4. Peterson's mere presence on social media and YouTube will be called into question. Well, there we go. That's exactly what happened to me, isn't it? Calls will be made for his hateful rhetoric that encourages harassment to be banned from the internet. Marxist trans advocates are already doing this, but online media will follow suit. It's the same old strategy from the far left. If you lose a debate, reframe their arguments as harassment and ban, harass, and smear the person making them. They did this at full force to Milo, says the guy. The Belfast Telegraph released a headline. I got all this, by the way, from this Twitter account, and there's a great blog post I'll tell you about in a minute. The Belfast Telegraph says this: the anti-snowflake crusader. To his fans, Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson is a hero of rationality, but to his critics, he's an alt-right transphobe. To his critics, let me let you in on a little secret of the press, of the media, of how journalists work. To his critics is a sleight of hand. It's a fudge. It's a maneuver that enables the journalist to say about you what they secretly themselves want to say without having to cite anybody else saying it, without having to find out if anybody outside newsrooms and university campuses actually believes that, without having to find out if anyone at all believes that, aside from the specific writer of the piece and perhaps their editor. His critics say, in a headline, you'll find this as a curious pattern, and these headlines that say, critics allege, blah, 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 or according to his critics, blah, blah, blah. Very often in the piece itself, it shows no evidence whatsoever. There's no examples, there are no quotes, nothing. But the job has been done by that headline, because people sort of assume, oh, well, headlines are a sort of loose approximation of what the story contains. No, these headlines are being used to confect reputational damage. They're used to imagine criticisms that don't exist except in the furthest fringes of the far left. Imagine if a headline read, and this is the Twitter guy that I mentioned, to her critics, Linda Sarsour is an Islamist scam artist who wants to cut women's clits off. Well, that's what they're doing to Jordan Peterson. Also, compare the volume of coverage now. Compare the amount of coverage that you've seen about this supposed harassment crisis. And this is repeating itself. It's historic. Again and again. Gamergate, Milo, all this stuff. Compare the amount of coverage that you're seeing about this harassment issue with the amount of coverage about the debate itself. Because the debate itself was ignored completely by the left and by the mainstream. Why? Because it embarrassed them so much, it obliterated them. And because Cathy Newman looks so retarded in it as well, next to somebody who so obviously intellectually outclassed her. There's been a problem with my interview giving too. So nobody's talking about it anymore. This is misdirection. This is doing it on purpose. This is a strategy. It's exactly the point. Nobody remembers anymore who was saying what. That's why they do it. It's a disaster for the left. But the only thing worse for the left, the only bigger disaster for the left, would be if Cathy Newman had received no misogynistic abuse. Because then what would they do?
By putting people uncomfortably on the spot.
Yeah.
Still, women aren't going to make it. That's what you're really
It
saying.
depends on your measurement techniques. They're doing just fine in medicine. And so all those things were going on at the same time. And then, of course, underneath that is the fact that there was an ideological battle being played out. I would say a threefold ideological battle. There was a battle between her position, which was radically neo-Marxist, postmodernist, I would say. She was arguing against who she thought I was, and so that was the battle. And then there was the position I was trying to put forward, which had virtually nothing to do with what she was discussing.
She was fighting your strawman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it was like I was able to remain reasonably detached during the interview because I realized almost immediately that whoever she was talking to bore very little resemblance to me.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, she was quite sophisticated in some sense in what she did, because she did manage to sort of... Her claims became so preposterous and so self-contradictory that it was difficult to remain completely detached. And I think, and this was the crux of the interview, and I think the part that's attracted the most attention, she had asked me at one point in a provocatively self-righteous manner just what gave me the right to assume that my privilege of free speech, let's put it that way, gave me the right to potentially offend someone and hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
Why
Well,
should
that's
your...
what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while. You have...
And I thought about 6 things at the same time. But the first thing I thought was, you're a journalist. That's the last question in the world you should ever ask someone if you have any genuine integrity as a journalist. Because that's all you have as a journalist. You have the right to offend people and hurt their feelings. And so I called her out on that. I said, look, you know, all you've done in the last 20 minutes is everything you possibly could to make me as uncomfortable as you possibly can. Yeah. And I said it in a way that I would say was designed to let her know that I knew exactly what she was doing. And then I suggested that that was actually okay, because she had every right to do that, but that she couldn't have it both ways. She couldn't make her living and her reputation using those tactics, let's say. And those, for her, those weren't tactics of seeking the truth. They were almost purely tactics of domination, right, and one-upmanship. Yeah. And maybe, you know, if you live in the postmodernist world, you don't believe in truth anyways. There's just victory and power games, and so perhaps that's what she was pursuing. I don't know exactly what she was pursuing, but it was so palpably obvious to the two of us at that point that she had, in fact, done nothing except try to make me uncomfortable, that calling her on it left her speechless. And then that was the only time, I would say, when I actually spoke to the genuine human being instead of the ideological front.
So the ideological front, it fell off briefly, and then you said, I got you?
Yeah, well, I would say technically, and this might be interesting for people who are interested in Jungian psychology, if you want to understand what Carl Jung meant by animus possession, which is a very difficult concept, then that interview was a textbook case of having a discussion with someone who is animus possessed. And I can't explain what that means because it's very complicated, but if you go and read Jung and you read about animus possession and you need a demonstration of it so that that you get a sense of what it means, then that interview is exactly indicative of that. And I would say, as advice to people, maybe it's more like education, with anyone who is animus possessed, their goal is to engage you in the argument. If you engage in the argument on the terms they've defined, you lose. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. Yeah. You lose as soon as you engage in the argument. And so what I did in the interview was just not engage in the argument. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. and it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never said
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as when I say what I believe to be true, it's provocative. I don't provoke. Maybe for humor,
don't set out to
now
provoke.
and then. I'm not interested in provoking.
But what
Not
about
in
the thing
least.
about, you know, fighting and the lobster? Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a
48 hours after Channel 4's disastrous live interview with Professor Jordan Peterson, the YouTube video Channel 4 somewhat ill-advisedly released has now attracted over 2 million views. And if you Google Jordan Peterson, Cathy Newman, you'll find a global interest in this clash of ideologies. There are links in Spanish and German and French and loads of other languages because there's this massive interest in this apparently innocuous interview. It's an extraordinary reaction to a political video. It doesn't compare in viewing figures to a Britney Spears vid in which she extols the virtues of veganism or leather handbag accessories, of course, but in political terms, this degree of global fascination in something as dull as the alleged gender wage gap is entirely unprecedented. So what is the driving force behind this Jordan-Cathy phenomenon? And the answer to that's easy. We hunger for real political debate in Britain because we're starved of real political debate in Britain. The authoritarian liberal elites control the means of information, and they never usually allow anyone like Professor Peterson anywhere near a studio. Their no platform for the right means that we're fed this unending diet of politically correct dogma via the mouths of the anointed liberal elite who know they don't represent popular opinion but who work tirelessly to make damn sure no one's allowed anywhere near the media bubble to propose a learned, valid, legitimate opinion. And this isn't because the liberal elite fear our ideology per se, it's because they fear being utterly unable to refute our ideology. And this no platforming doesn't just apply to the genuine right, it's aimed at every person and every idea which disagrees with a far left viewpoint. And this creates a massive pent-up demand in Britain to actually hear the unvarnished factual truth. And into this vacuum of truth stepped Professor Jordan Peterson, who somehow sneaked past the bouncers. He vaulted the tasseled gold ropes and he whipped into the hallowed VIP liberal arena from where he was, most unusually, allowed to make his non-left-wing argument. And of course he won the argument hands down. He intellectually destroyed Cathy Newman, who was exposed for the close-minded, limited intelligence, slogan-shouting, unthinking leftist she so undoubtedly is. But this was so much more than just one wise and impartial person exposing another's ignorance and bias. This was an attack on the all-powerful authoritarian liberal establishment itself, and for the first time in Britain, or at least in my living memory, the liberal establishment was confronted and utterly traduced and utterly exposed. And this is why there's such interest in Jordan Peterson versus Channel 4, because he spoke for the disenfranchised millions of us who shout a great deal at the telly. But here was a man actually on the telly, live, unedited, uncensored, masterfully schooling the childlike social justice warrior Newman, the sort of person that we can only usually shout at. What an occasion! What a gift of oxygen for those of us suffocated by the dishonest, treacherous mainstream media mafia, who the number of big lies the mainstream media is able to keep in the air, courtesy of their totalitarian lockout of all counter-argument. Global warming is one, Islam is a religion of peace another, and gender fluidity yet another, amongst at least 20 big leftist lies. But in this particular instance, it was the gender pay gap lie that was completely dismantled by Professor Peterson, much to Cathy Newman's consternation, and as such the authoritarian liberal establishment was dealt a crushing blow, and one imagines that if C4 could turn the clock back, they wouldn't let Professor Peterson anywhere near them. The damage he has done to them is immense. But a Cathy Newman-Jordan Peterson contest was always going to be one-sided. Look at the stratospheric differences between them. Peterson is blessed with a high IQ and an inquiring mind, which he's built on over many years of deeply thinking on the realities of life and nature. His political leaning, which is classical liberal, was formed by viewing and looking at the real world around him, and he's now given voice to his opinions via books and videos which have been seized upon by millions of people. He's helped thousands of women become more assertive and achieve higher salaries, and he's given confidence to millions of young men who feel that they live their lives as second-class citizens in our new authoritarian, liberal, matriarchal utopia. But Cathy Newman, on the other hand, possesses only an above-average IQ, and she's done nothing constructive to make up for this otherwise excusable deficiency. She was never quite clever enough to question the bleeding obvious propaganda rammed down her throat at school and Oxford University. And as a consequence, she's absorbed it in its entirety. She's never actually thought, really seriously thought about anything at all. She's completely closed-minded. An inquiring mind is anathema to her. She's surrounded herself with identical people all of her professional life. In her social life, she never hears an opinion other than the opinion she was brainwashed into believing by her Marxist dons at Oxford University. She relies on manufactured grievance rather than substantive truth. She wants the world to mirror her fantastical political opinions rather than allowing reality to form her political opinions. And short of screeching inequality and patriarchy repetitively and loudly, she has done nothing to actually address the issues she purports to care greatly about. And if she lost the privilege of anchoring a prime-time national news channel and relied instead on YouTube to articulate her political views like Jordan Peterson, she wouldn't even be mocked. She'd simply be ignored. So when she came up against Professor Peterson, who was prepared to bravely speak substantive truth to dishonest privileged power, there was only ever going to be one winner. And Ms. Newman foolishly treated Professor Peterson as the enemy from the outset. She knew nothing about his background. She and her research team, if you can call them that, failed to recognise potential problems because they arrogantly imagined they were the intellectually impregnable anointed. And even worse, she failed to acknowledge the fact that Peterson works on behalf of all humanity. She couldn't recognise this because she's so wrapped up in her shrill, sloganist, selfish, feminist self. She shouted and she projected and insinuated, but she had no facts, no data, no research, nothing to back up anything she said. She smeared. She was disingenuous. She didn't listen. And when she was occasionally forced to listen, she either didn't register what the wise professor was actually saying, or it just went clean over her head. The gotcha moment is delicious, but it's painful to see how long it took for the obvious to finally dawn on her as the cogs slowly turned in the treacly mush of her propagandised brain. She allowed her unfounded prejudices toward Professor Peterson to cloud her moral, journalistic and intellectual judgment, if it could actually be described as such. And there are countless moments to enjoy in this video, but my personal favourite is when Ms. Newman expressed near total bemusement about far-left transgender activists being linked to the death of millions in Mao's China. And Professor Peterson gently and slowly explained to the recalcitrant Ms. Newman that it was the identical authoritarian leftist ideology that lay behind the slaughter of millions. But Ms. Newman, unfortunately, yet probably entirely predictably, failed to follow this brand new concept of factual reality or historical reality. And an interesting question here would be, how far removed is Ms. Newman herself from the murder of all those who disagree with her authoritarian liberal ideology? Suppose Channel 4 made another catastrophic blunder and inexplicably allowed Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch 30 minutes of primetime TV to argue with clever Cathy against Islam being a religion of peace. Ms. Newman would have lost badly. She would have been publicly exposed as a witless dimwit, as a vapid ideologue. She would have become very angry. She would have compared Robert Spencer to a fascist, to a Nazi, an Islamophobe. Her eyes would have filled with passion and hate. And if given a choice between siding with the gentle Mr. Spencer or the ultra-violent leftist foot soldiers of Antifa, she would side with Antifa, a paramilitary leftist organisation that genuinely does desire to liquidate, to murder the erstwhile and honest Robert Spencer. And if the fragrant Cathy was a smidgen more intelligent and actually capable of critical thought, she might just startle herself in the knowledge of how close she and the entire authoritarian liberal establishment is, in ideological terms, to full-blown murderous far-left carnage. But she won't, though, because self-awareness is not really part of the liberal makeup. And a good example of this is the pathological refusal by Channel 4 journalists and producers to recognise the extent of their exposure and to actually try to put right the reasons behind this. Krishnan Guru Murthy tweeted his anguish over the loads, quote, of abusive tweets attacking poor, defenceless, frail, feminine Cathy. So I asked him, in his role as a fearless, incisive, investigative Channel 4 journalist, whether he could clarify what he meant by loads. He didn't reply, but it would seem that the loads apparently is 1% of the comments are abusive, which means that the valid 99% of the comments are now being ignored by Channel 4 in their totality. And by doing this, they add insult to injury. They first underestimate Professor Peterson, then they try to smear him as an alt-right sexist promoting misogyny and the patriarchy. And when this spectacularly backfires, they then accuse everyone who agreed with Professor Peterson of being misogynistic fascists. And as such, they don't feel they need to explain just why Channel 4 behaves as it has done and is continuing to do so. So, in other words, they view constructive criticism as a hate crime, or at least they pretend to do, in order to ignore it completely whilst feeling morally justified in doing so. How convenient. How achingly totalitarian. And I can just picture the Channel 4 newsroom late 2 nights ago. Krishnan Guru Murthy, John without an H, down with the Glastonbury kids, fuck the Tories, Snow, and the tremulous Cathy herself, looking through the comments and screeching, there, look at this misogynistic one, what ghastly, oh, excuse me, what ghastly, fascistic little lumpen proletarians they are. And of course they'll totally ignore the legitimate criticism, because as the new aristocracy, they're above all that sort of lowbrow plebeian vulgarity. And this is also something they're unaware of. They really are the new bourgeois aristocracy rather than the revolutionary vanguard they witlessly believe themselves to be. And Cathy Newman and her fellow travellers are part of the elite who provide the intellectual foundation for the social justice movement. They're mostly middling intelligence but highly educated white middle and upper class intellectuals from the political left in advanced Western economies. And over the past few decades, this group has become increasingly powerful, and it's now become the new bourgeoisie, much like the one Marx and the early critical theorists sought to overthrow. And this new 21st century bourgeois aristocracy utilizes many of the mechanisms the totalitarian communists use in controlling society, suppressing criticism through control of the news media and now social media, enforcing rigid etiquette in speech and behaviour, using the education system to teach its values, and most importantly, representing its own interest as universal values and beliefs, and denouncing and demonising any person who suggests an alternative viewpoint. Stalin's saboteurs and fascists have become today's racist Islamophobes and alt-righters. Alt-right and provocateur, incidentally, were two smears thrown at Professor Peterson by the egregious Ms. Newman, and in rather a provocative manner, I thought. Marx always claimed the aristocracy was maintained